Welcome to this webinar on the idea puzzle. I want to thank the Center for Documentation and Information Management of the Rectorship of University of Porto, in particular Ana Gonçalves for organizing this webinar. I want you to remember that this is a 1 hour webinar for the specific purpose of promoting the Idea Puzzle prize that we organize every year. For that reason, the webinar will be in English because the applications for the Idea Puzzle prize are exclusively in English. It's an international prize. So for that reason, I'll be giving this webinar today in English. It's just 1 hour. This is, as you can see in your screen, it is a theoretical framework. It's a model of doctoral research. So it's complex in the sense that you have 21 decisions, but because it's complex, because it is comprehensive, it is supposed to minimize the risks of a research project. Over time, in 3-4 years, in a long project like the PhD, I would say it's fairly likely that something will go wrong. So my inspiration for creating this model was precisely my own PhD about 20 years ago in Finland, where I realized after 1 year of literature review that I couldn't find a single example of my topic. So my topic was very prone to literature review. In my field of strategic management, I was interested in strategic alliances and firm internationalization. And to my astonishment, not IESEP in Portugal or FinPro in Finland, these international trade and foreign direct investment agencies, none of them was able to give me access to one example of a strategic alliance between a Portuguese and a Finnish company. For that reason, I realized that my sample wouldn't be possible in year 2. So in my second year of my PhD, I had to start all over again. So time itself, year after year, is itself a risk if you think in terms of integrating the different parts of your PhD. So this triangle represents precisely that disintegration I experienced myself. On the left side of this triangle, we have 5 questions for you to focus and give coherence to your literature review. Okay, we call it theoretical questions, but for philosophers of science, it means epistemology, nature of knowledge. And I must say that the reason why this tool is inspired by philosophy of science, it is because back then, when I had that problem with lack of data, I took an elective course on philosophy of science, and I must say it saved my PhD. It gave me a completely different perspective of my work. It doesn't mean that it changes what you're doing, but it's a bit like comparing, if you allow me the analogy, Google Street View and Google Earth, that zoom out you have with the planet Earth below. So philosophy of science is really a zoom out from your daily worries with your research project. So the left side means epistemology, as I said, and the bottom side of this triangle is about methodology, so nature of research. And finally, the right side, my weak point, if you remember, my weak point in my PhD, and a system is as strong as the weakest link, is ontology, the nature of reality. Now, I wonder how many of us have taken a course on philosophy of science, even if PhD means Doctor of Philosophy, point number 1. Point number 2, I wonder how many of us are thinking systemically from day one. So making sure in your research proposal, even before you enroll into a PhD, or that research proposal you have to defend at the end of the first year in your PhD, or in this particular article you are planning to publish, if it's empirical research, or a monograph, traditional monograph for the whole PhD after 3-4 years. I wonder how many of us are thinking integratively, okay, like this triangle. So that's the purpose of this model. And you might be asking already, what about the inner part of the triangle? Well, the inner part of the triangle is more related with the conclusions. So basically, when you write the conclusions of a paper, usually you make sure that you answer the research question or the hypothesis you are testing. You address limitations in your work, and you think about avenues for future research, recommendations for future research, and finally, practical implications. That's something I'm going to address in the inner part of the triangle, plus your role in the project as the principal investigator. So I say that the 6 questions in the inner part of the triangle of this model, they represent axiology, what philosophers of science mean by the nature of values, your values as a researcher and the values of your audience. So as I said, it's not complicated. I will explain in a very logical way the connection between these 21 decisions, but it's complex, okay? Experts on theory development will tell you that any model with more than 7 elements, it's complex, but it's not complicated. And if you think about these 5 elements I said, then it's simple, just 5 ingredients, okay? Theory on the left, method on the bottom, data on the right, and then, as I told you, the conclusions and your own CV in the bottom. So 5 elements. So theoretical, methodological, empirical, rhetorical, and authorial questions. Only 5 types of questions. Now, I like the metaphor of puzzle based on my experience 20 years ago. You can imagine my problem was that I thought as a project manager. I thought sequentially, right? I was thinking, okay, first year literature review, second year data collection and analysis, third year thesis writing. Yeah, it's okay. You can think like that. Time is chronological, right? It's sequential, but there's nothing wrong about using a systemic model like this one so that you don't delay some of these decisions. And I like the puzzle because the puzzles are not, don't impose a sequence, right? You can assemble this puzzle in any sequence you want. I'm going to explain in one sequence. As you can see, the numbers there, 1 to 21, both when you browse the triangle or when you read above the text box. But I like most of all with puzzles that the easiest pieces are the last ones. So the worst thing you can do to your project is to delay these decisions, to have these 21 decisions pending as a circular problem, right? It's you should start with whatever decisions you have. And in that spirit, the software, the Idea Puzzle software that you have access with an email ending up.pt or uporto.pt. That's why I chose that article from my document today, my research design. The software will allow you to self-evaluate in terms of decision-making progress, okay? So it's not in terms of content. Content is something that I completely trust your supervisors to judge. Even when you apply to the prize, I ask you a letter of recommendation from your supervisor, okay? So I'm not here to judge the content of your research design, and I even yourself, I suggest you share the Idea Puzzle document with your supervisors. That's why you can download it in Word for them to insert comments and track changes. But I would like that you self-evaluate yourself in terms of decision-making progress. Remember my problem? I delayed too much time, 1 year, the data collection, okay? And I had to start all over again in the second year. So lots of first-hand experience here. That's why I have this passion for this model. And let's get started now with the 21 decisions. I don't have much time, right? So I'll have to be very superficial in my presentation. If you want a deeper knowledge of each of these 21 questions, what I suggest is that you click help. You know, help is bold, you know, it's the only button of the software that is bold. You know why? Because I want you to read it and see examples of prize winning in different disciplines, research design. So these research designs you have here, and it's growing every year with the Idea Puzzle Prize. They won the Idea Puzzle Prize. So I'm making sure you have good examples, okay? Idea Puzzle Prize winning. I have introductions like a glossary, right? I define what I mean by each of the concepts in the Idea Puzzle. I give you an introduction of the debates, and then I give you initial bibliography. And finally, you have my email at the end if you want to share your own tips with me, because I have over 100 tips here to make these 21 decisions. And I get them from you every year. So let's get started. And I will follow this sequence, but as I said, you can follow your own. What do I mean by keywords? I think keywords, if you want in a nutshell, are concepts. Philosophers love concepts. They even say they are on the left side of our brain. So I'm going to challenge you to, in the spirit of a 3-minute thesis, to present your title, your research project, again, research proposal, article, or thesis. If you have an article-based dissertation, please make one idea puzzle per paper, not for the whole PhD, this thesis. The title should be 2 concepts, okay? So I'm going to give the example of my second topic when I had to solve that problem. And my 2 concepts were personal contacts of managers in multinationals and multinational coordination. Okay, I'm giving you two concepts. And the first tip you will find when you click help is that it's better for you to have 2 concepts than just one. Okay, if you have one concept, you are implicitly relating your project to any other concept. So it's not focused yet. Okay. And if you have 3 concepts, you are increasing the complexity of your work much more than you imagine, probably, because with 2 concepts, I already have to decide which direction, because I can be personal contacts and multinational coordination, that's one direction, or multinational coordination and personal contacts, that's another direction. So I can make 2 literature reviews, 2 papers with each of those 2 directions. When you have 3 concepts, you go from 2 directions to 6. It's 3 times more complex than 2. Okay, so this could be an exercise for us to make. Just present to another person. My title are 2 concepts. Of course, each concept can have more than 1 word, but it's important to bear in mind the quantity of concepts in your title. Of course, you can elaborate in the text, but that would be your focus. So we are focusing already here with the direction, but also with definitions, right? Concepts without definitions are meaningless. So in my case, I define personal contacts as communication between 2 persons, okay? And this means that I wasn't happy with the existing definitions. I wanted 2 persons, not teams, and I wanted remote communication as well, not just face-to-face. But when it comes to multinational coordination, I was happy with existing definitions, integration of dispersed units of the multinational. So that was an existing definition from Martinez in Yarillo 89. Okay, so you see that I'm not writing lots of text, I'm making decisions. Okay, and I'm going to make it here fully decided, or in a scale of 3, which means 3 traffic lights. So it's a strength. I know what I'm doing in terms of title and focus. Okay, now the second challenge is, if you choose this topic, or if you change the topic, you change the experts. So when we think about experts, I don't mean references, okay? We tend to have a narrow view of expertise. We look at bibliographic references and we forget that science is made of communities of experts worldwide. And those are more hidden, okay? Philosophers and especially sociologists of science, they talk about these as, Kuhn would call paradigms, Lakato's research programs, Loudon research traditions. Sometimes we say schools of thought. Here I like the term streams of thought. Let me give you again an example from my own PhD. In my case, I was a Portuguese in Finland, so I knew about the Nordic school of multinationals. But my literature review would be not just boring, it would be incomplete if I wouldn't acknowledge at least an opposing literature stream of thought. If you have a thesis, you have to have an antithesis to have a synthesis. So I also spoke about the American school of multinationals. So another challenge for you, are you able to show that you are an expert because you know the expert, but also the debates between the experts? And in terms of debates, they can be theoretical because, you know, they both talk about multinationals, but for Nordics, the multinational corporation cannot be managed top down, just bottom up. So we call that the organic assumption. You know, we assume theoretically that these companies are too large to be controlled top down, but the Americans, they believe so. So it's we call it the design assumption. So can you talk about the theoretical assumptions of these two streams of thought? Okay, that's a challenge here. Now, if you click help, the help function will be different again. You will see a different page now just for these questions. So we have 21 different help functions pages. And what I suggest here as main tip is read published literature reviews, because the most cited journals on earth are literature review journals. They only publish literature reviews. I'm talking about journals, not just articles. Of course, the articles will give you the territory of your field, but I also like very much exchanges. You know why? Because when journals invite authors to criticize each other in the same issue, they are showing you that indeed we have opposing streams of thought. Not easy, but crucial to make your literature review interesting. Because it's not so easy, I chose to self-evaluate as partially decided. Okay, it's ongoing, work in progress literature review. Now, the next challenge is the research gap. We also tend to be a little bit ambiguous with the research gap. So I'm going to say something about the research gap. To me, if I'm very focused, your research gap is something you can quote. I'm not even saying cite. It's not about citation, okay? I wish you have a quote like the one I found out in my PhD, which said something like, in the future, we need to know more about managers networking in multinationals. I mean, when I read this, I still remember now, when I read this, I felt like Axelson 92. Just don't remember the page. I felt like this is like a diamond, you know, there is someone out there in the conclusions of a paper making recommendations for the future, and it's saying exactly what I want to do in my research. And I call that legitimation, isn't it? Legitimation instead of convenience. It's not because I'm researching something that the experts actually ask for the future. And for that reason, because it's a kind of diamond in your literature review, I chose to evaluate it as undecided. I think that often we find this, you know, this diamond by accident, is serendipity. Of course, if you want to be more systematic, you can read just conclusions of papers until you find this quote. Now, almost concluding the structuring and focusing of my literature review, I would ask you if you are aware that when we talk about research questions, I see a couple of typical flaws. So basically, we make statements, not questions. I see people writing statements because the questions do not have a certain format. And what do I mean by question format? If you click help in this particular decision, you will see that some scientists, they are very much aware that up to the Nobel Prize, science is making 5 basic questions about any empirical phenomena. The first is what to identify, say a new planet, a new phenomenon, a new disease like COVID, how to describe, why to explain, when to predict, and how much to control. And this structure is very useful, not just for the Nobel Prize. It's also because it shows you that the experts we have been talking about so far, they actually should be in one of these levels. And if they are already quantifying how much to control, it's probably too late to describe qualitatively. And if they are still identifying or describing or explaining with qualitative methods, exploratory questions, it's probably premature to quantify. So in a way, we try to be aligned with the experts. So my challenge to you now is, can you tell us what's the level of the experts? What level are they working on of these five? If it's 1 to 3, as I told you, I would expect more qualitative. And if it's 4 to 5, I would expect more quantitative, okay, in general. So interesting structure. Philosophers are very structured in their thinking, and it might help you to phrase the question with one of these formats, because it's 5 levels of knowledge depth. In my case, I'm going to give my example again. I didn't choose, I saw the experts were still exploring the informal side of multinationals. So it was how personal contacts, exactly the same concepts in my title, how personal contacts, and then I need the verb influence, if you want, influence multinational coordination. And with this, I'm not just aligned with the experts, I'm coherent with the experts, but I'm also coherent with my title, right? Exactly the same concepts, exactly in the same direction. So you can see that we are still only in the 4th challenge out of 21, and we can already imagine how often we are not following these rules of philosophy of science, and we are disintegrating or taking coherence from our work as researchers. The ingredients are there. As I say, philosophy of science doesn't change much what you're doing, but you can make it a little bit more rigorous. Finally, to conclude, state of science or state of art, another ambiguous word. If we want to be very focused, all I'm asking you is the current answer to your research question, okay? And if you were in levels 4, 5, it was not a question, remember, it was usually it tends to be hypothesis testing already. So hypotheses rather than questions. So the state of science can be the current answer to your research question or the current results to the same hypothesis testing, okay? To your hypothesis testing. Now, let me give you an analogy. When I submit a book proposal, you know what editors answer? Okay, you say you want to publish a book with us? Fine, but tell us the 3 books that come closer to your book. Because you can never say something that still some PhD candidates love saying, there is nothing about it. Please don't say that ever, because we are publishing 3 million articles per year globally. So all I'm asking you is 3 references, okay? 3 references out of 3 million references per year. And the ones that actually touch upon your same question or same hypothesis. And this is not losing originality. On the contrary, it's showing that you are in full control of what you're doing. You know exactly who your peers are around the world, okay? So I think you are starting to see what idea puzzle does, right? Is food for thought. It's forcing you to think about what you're doing. So I'm going to make a small pause in my own talking and make you one of my favorite questions. If you can answer, please. Have you ever attended a course on philosophy of science? Because it saved my own PhD, okay? And to me, it will always be a paradox that PhD means Doctor of Philosophy. You graduate with a PhD and you have never taken a course on philosophy of science, okay? Unfortunately, I think I could generalize now that I've presented this seminar to over 12,000 people that usually less than 20% of us have taken a course on philosophy of science. Today we have 7%. So here's the invitation for you to do it before you graduate. I think it would be great for you and for society in general, because you are a doctor of philosophy at the end, okay? My second question to you, which is relevant, is the format of your PhD, because I want to remind you that if you are doing an article-based PhD, do not try to fit the 3 papers in idea puzzle. Make one idea puzzle per paper, okay? A paper is one idea, not two. So idea puzzle means one idea per paper. If you are doing dissertation, you can make one idea puzzle. But if you are doing paper-based, remember to make one idea puzzle per paper. That's very important to focus. And today, I see here about 60% of us are doing paper-based, okay? So that's important to remember. Okay, let's go on. Time is short. A lot to say in 1 hour. Let's do the same reasoning. Let's focus your methods section, your methodology. We love to talk about qualitative methods, quantitative methods, mixed methods. I don't think a doctor of philosophy should start the methodological section or chapter with method, what experts call research strategy. I think you should start with philosophy again. Why? Because philosophical stance here, again, it could be research stance, research perspective. I mean, the philosophical assumptions of a doctor of philosophy paper or thesis, in my opinion, the easiest way to understand is to call them, I'm going to call them type of conclusions, okay? I'm going to use this notion of conclusions, the conclusions you're going to write, rather than the isms that tend to generate a lot of confusion, right? If we talk about isms like positivism, post-positivism, modernism, postmodernism, I think it becomes a forest of isms, and it's too much for especially a beginner researcher or a doctoral researcher. So instead of a forest of isms that philosophy creates every day, I will talk only about four isms, meta-isms, four types of conclusions. And basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at science as a whole, or the university as a whole, and I'm thinking, interesting, some of us do not measure anything. When I read the conclusions of some disciplines, what I call qualitative objectivism, I see that they are just describing facts. I'm going to give you the example of history. I hear historians and they say, well, it's a fact that there and then this happened. It's not subjective, it's objective. It happened, okay? But there's nothing to measure about it. Even if I use numbers, it's just to give context in which year it was, okay? I'm describing, this is science. So I would expect that if you have already focused your paper into two concepts only in your title, remember, you still have to focus on the type of conclusions you want to make. Basically, what I'm saying is that I can make 4 different papers with the same title, 4 different types of conclusions. Now, the dominant view of science ever since the 19th century is, of course, as you know, quantitative objectivism. Here you are thinking about facts, but you try to measure them. Okay, so I'm going to write here quantitative objectivism. It's about measure. You want to measure facts. And here I'm going to give you the example of engineering, economics, medicine. Okay, fine. But I think I can do 2 papers with different conclusions with the same topic. Then the third type of science I see is qualitative subjectivism. And here I want to describe not facts, but meanings. And the example I can give you is anthropology, okay? Anthropology studies a tribe, for instance, and we try to understand their values, how they see the world, their culture. Nothing factual is subjective, but we describe it with detail. And finally, because this is a matrix, I can talk about quantitative subjectivism, which means I look at quantitative psychology, for instance, and they're trying to measure values, meanings, like personality differences, with the exact same methods as number 2, okay? And if I talk about the fields of, for instance, education, I think they are also qualitative subjectivists. I mean, social constructivism is an example of an ism that I hear all the time in education. it means it's qualitative subjectivism umbrella. So, big challenge for you. What type of conclusion you want in this particular paper? Because I can make a paper about the same topic in each of these. For instance, in my case, I chose number one. In my case, I chose qualitative objectivism. For me, personal contacts were facts, and multinational coordination were facts, okay? And I described that. I show that qualitatively, I made a model that personal contacts bring information, help decision-making, and therefore they help coordinate the multinational. Is it quantitative? No. Is it objective? Yes, because I'm not asking what's the meaning of personal contacts, okay? But I had managers, for instance, wanting to talk about personal contacts corruption as a negative thing. That's meaning, but I didn't want to explore. That would be another research project, okay? So I can make 4 papers, 4 types of conclusions per each topic you give me in your keywords. So if you can position yourself, would be good. Another good reason to position yourself is that when we talk about qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, what we mean is a research strategy. And this concept is important because research strategy means a study, okay? A theoretical answer, or let's put it, theoretical conclusion. But to be theoretical, you cannot talk about your study as a data collection or data analysis technique. There is a lot of confusion because we use method for both. Oh, method as the study, method as the data collection, method as data analysis. So in this framework, we are separating them very clearly. Take the example now of philosophical stance 1. What research strategies, what studies can you make to describe facts? Number 1, well, I talk about the historians, right? Historical method. If it's individual, could be a biography. If it's a contemporary history, would be a case study. But look at this detail. A case study is not a case, is a study. It's a theoretical conclusion. Action research, if you want to solve a problem at the same time. And many others I could give you. I mean, I could talk about in music, artistic research, in design science. I mean, so many grounded theory, so many different research strategies. But what they have in common is that they want to describe facts qualitatively. But then if you want to measure, you know that you have a lab experiment, full control over variables. If you don't have full control, is because it's secondary data, I would call it field experiment. If it's in the open reality, of course, large scale surveys, right? Very common. And to some extent, I would say also computer simulations, okay? And then the anthropologists, remember? Because they are interested in describing meanings, not facts. They need other type of qualitative methods like ethnography, or to interpret texts, hermeneutics, or to be critical about the press, content analysis, or to be critical about individual values, individual narratives. I'm just giving you some examples, okay? But to show you that these 4 philosophical stances, if I put 2 and 4 together because they are both quantitative and 1 and 3 separated, you see there are 3 different toolboxes. So you should choose a research method, a research strategy, based on what you want to answer, what type of conclusions you want to make. It's a bit like if you want to cut wood, you choose the saw. If you want to cut paper, you choose the scissors. Critical choice of method is first deciding what conclusions you want to make. Unfortunately, I don't see this discussion on the philosophical choice of conclusions in most of the doctoral research publications. And that's a pity, because then it means that probably you are using a method just because. It's like giving a hammer to a kid and everything looks like a nail. Okay, it's not as critical as saying, I want to describe facts, I have these choices, I choose one or two of these. If you ask me, do I need mixed methods? In almost everything I say in idea puzzle, I say, don't triangulate if that increases complexity. So I will always tell you, it's good to triangulate the methods, for instance, but triangulation brings complexity, okay? It's the opposite of parsimony. Parsimony, the only law of philosophy of science with someone's name, Occam's razor, okay? Always choose what is simple in terms of research design. So I don't suggest triangulation usually. Okay, that's what I wanted to tell you. And if you wanted to know more, I strongly suggest Creswell 2013 in more recent editions. He has a book of choosing among 5 traditions, you know, John Creswell. This is the inspiration I got for these 5 decisions at the bottom, okay? He's the one showing you how you go from philosophy to a study, from a study to a data collection, and then data analysis and quality. So briefly, what's data collection? Data collection, most of all, means data as an output, right? Data output. So it's not a study, okay? Never say that your study is interviews, for instance. Interviews only gives you data. Focus group only gives you data. Any type of questionnaire, right? Even if it's for a survey, a questionnaire only gives you data. It's not a study. It's not a conclusion, a theoretical conclusion. Documents, archives. Nowadays with the internet, sky's the limit, right? Talk about how you collect data, but don't call it a study. It's not a study, okay? So this box is for you to separate the two. Even worse than that is to assume that statistics are the study. No, because all statistic analysis you can make are just data analysis. And data analysis, again, is data output, right? You have numbers, fine. Are numbers a theoretical conclusion? No. Therefore, it's not a study, okay? It's not a study either. But what I think it's relevant and sometimes forgotten is that you should specify if your analysis is qualitative or quantitative. And I think that the reason we publish more quantitative research than qualitative is because for editors of journals, quantitative analysis is more transparent, you know, and it's easier to fit in a paper actually. Because if you specify the statistical analysis you made, descriptive or inferential, you are transparent and others can replicate, okay? But if you don't, in qualitative, if you don't specify the coding frame, the coding analysis of your text and other types of data, then qualitative research won't be transparent. So I think there is, again, here a trade-off between being transparency, and replication. How can others replicate something that is not transparent? And I think qualitative tends to be less transparent unless you address very clearly the coding of your data. And I should add something important, which is one way to improve the transparency is the research software. The more you share about the research software for qualitative or quantitative, the more transparent you become. So these are not difficult decisions. It's just that they tend to be a little bit less transparent. Finally, John Creswell and others would tell us that when we talk about quality criteria, what we are talking about is something that philosophers call paradigm incommensurability. I love this concept. It means that maybe we are unfair victims and victimizers of unfair peer review. Wow, that's shocking. But what do I mean? It means that imagine you write a paper in philosophical stance number 1, okay? You are describing facts. And then you have a reviewer who has never done that. they have only measured facts. Most likely the reviewer will judge you with the quality criteria of its philosophical stance, okay? Worst, you want to describe meanings and you have a reviewer that describes facts. You have an inexperienced, unqualified reviewer to review a paper, okay? So I'm going to show you a little bit how these quality criteria are different in the 3 toolboxes I gave you, okay? 1 and then 2 and 4, which are quantitative. So remember the historian? Do historians want to generalize? Because we are so obsessed with external validity in science. Well, they talk about analytical generalization, you know, not statistical. You should never accept a reviewer to tell you that your qualitative research is not generalizable, because it's always generalizable, but it's not statistical, okay? It's what philosophers of science call analytical generalization, because you know what? Qualitative research is good to explore the first case of something, first case of COVID, a new planet, a new animal species, a new plant, a new type of cell, or drug to cure a disease. So if you show us something we don't know, it's publishable in itself without statistical generalization, probabilistic or not. But if you are in stance number 2, quantitative, and 4, then we are talking about statistical generalization. So very subtle but important difference. The same with the internal validity. What is internal validity? Well, internal validity is to describe what you want to describe. Sometimes we don't have data to describe what I want to describe. Whereas in 2 and 4, it's to measure. It's not the same internal validity. Of course, they share notions like construct validity, that people understand the questionnaire, whether qualitative or quantitative. Convergent validity, that you triangulate, but as I told you, with the limits of simplicity. And then they both have reliability, which means someone can repeat the study with the same results. And as I said, it tends to be a little bit higher, in my opinion, for quantitative research than qualitative, unless you talk about the coding. And then I must tell you that when you study, like anthropologists do, meanings instead of facts, you're gonna reject these notions of validity, reliability, and even triangulation, because we are not talking about facts. You can triangulate like a ship in high sea with 2 satellites. No, you cannot triangulate meaning. They actually say that meaning is like light in a crystal. It reflects in every direction. Human beings are creating new meanings every day. So they talk about crystallization instead of triangulation. And they talk about authenticity and trustworthiness instead of validity and reliability. So beware. To me, this is the most difficult decision of the 21. And all I can say is click help, start probably, I would say, with reference number 4, SAGE Handbook of Qualitative Research, and make yourself sure that you are a bit familiar with this paradigm incommensurability, with 3 different ways to judge the quality of your paper, and beware of unfair peer review, because I think it's out there every day. Well, I have to rush, but before I continue, I will make another question to you, which is, in general, I would say that universities are 50-50 in terms of the type of research they make. Because half of us likes to describe one case or few with a lot of detail, a lot of concepts, qualitatively, and others like to measure a couple of variables, 2 per hypothesis, with a large data set, lots of cases. So what's your vocation? Because if you like to describe and if you like synthesis, you probably prefer qualitative. But if you love mathematics and calculation, maybe you prefer quantitative. So what's your preference? And let's see if today again is 50-50. And I would say that today we have 56% quantitative. So very close to the 50-50 we usually see at the university. Thank you. Let's move on because time is short. And now I'm going to make sure you don't have the problem I had 20 years ago. I could never imagine that I would have to change my topic in the second year because I couldn't find one example of my phenomena, a strategic alliance between a Portuguese and a Finnish company. So to ensure that you have a sample, and I'm not talking about sampling technique. I had a sampling technique in my method. It's just that I couldn't have access to data, and the pandemic made it even worse. So let's make it less risky. I start with a unit of analysis, an entity or process in reality that you will compare, okay, to make the two concepts in your title vary. This is very important. Sometimes we have a sample of data, but it doesn't make vary the two concepts in our title. It doesn't answer the question, okay? So in my case, I chose something very usually in reality is common sense language, okay? It's not academic terminology, not the keywords we are using. People have to understand it, otherwise there is no construct validity. So I ask managers about their contact network, something in their language they understand. And the more they talk about contact network, the more they relate the two concepts in my title, personal contact and multinational coordination. And this increases internal validity. You answer what you want to answer, okay? So it's a bit challenging to ask you what you're going to compare in reality. What are you going to compare in your sample? But look at the experts. If you read their papers, you probably see what they are comparing. Another thing we forget is that we can compare, say, creativity in many different scales, like geography, right? Geographers give us map with a scale. And I see science as a set of scales from nanos to galaxies. That's why we use microscope and telescope. So what about you? What's your scale? Have you thought about it? And are you coherent? Do you have the same scale in the literature review and in your data? And you have one or two. For instance, in my case, I had to specify it's individual. I know I'm talking about multinational, which is organizational, but I'm primarily focused on the individual manager. And on top of that, we have editors asking multi-scale research, which I find super challenging, okay? Philosophers usually believe in emergent properties. If you change the scale, 100 nanos behave different from 1 nano. A mob behaves different from one person. So be careful. If reality is different, theories are different, maybe you shouldn't mix scales so easily. I leave it to you, just specify the scale. Then the nature of data can be first qualitative and second quantitative. Basic, yes. Sometimes we forget that qualitative is much more than words. For archaeologists, it's artifacts. And I would say today with the internet, I've seen, for instance, multimedia PhDs in Denmark, a PhD just with YouTube videos. Wonderful. So don't underestimate the amount of data we have other than words. And then yes, quantitative is numbers, but again, you have to choose what type of numbers, if discrete or continuous and so on. Origin of data. I would say that by default, our data is secondary. It means secondhand. And what's the problem with secondhand data? It has less internal validity. Because how can you describe what you want to describe? How can you measure what you want to measure if you didn't deduct yourself the questionnaire from your literature review to fit perfectly your research question or hypothesis? You know, that only happens with primary data. So primary data is first-hand data. You generate in your study and it answers perfectly to your research question. So I would say more internal validity. What's the problem here? It takes more time and resources. So it's a trade-off between the two. Usually we make a mix. So what's a sample? A set of one or more examples of your unit of analysis. So in my case, very specifically, I had 11 contact networks. What about you? Can you specify? And here is where I think you can avoid my mistake in my PhD. Be specific as you can, to be realistic as you can. From day one, not second year, from day one, I choose the topic, but I also choose the unit of analysis that operationalizes the topic and allows me to have a realistic sample in reality. Okay, a lot of information. But I will conclude now with the inner part of the triangle, because so far, what we did with the three sides of the triangle was to integrate and give coherence to an empirical research project. Theory, method, and data. It's the way we write any publication. And for philosophers, that's rigor, fine, but it's not yet relevance. Relevance is having an impact on society, okay? So I choose a word from Aristotle. For Aristotle, pathos are emotions. And people are only interested in our research, who cares? Only interested when you have an impact on them, other than scientists. So if I think about positive emotions, I think you should think about the public interest of your research. A good example is medicine, right? And also the commercial interest of your research. A good example here is engineering, okay? And this is something we usually address, I would say, in our conclusions, right? We talk about practical implications. So why think about it in the last minute when you're writing? No, think about it in the beginning. Even funding agencies, they will talk about dissemination, other organizations involved to give us funding because we have more impact. But there are also negative emotions, right? Nowadays, we talk about ethics, and we need ethical approval, and we have also conflicts of interest with other persons or organizations involved. So this is to address emotions in our research. Don't assume there are no emotions. There are always emotions. Then Aristotle will talk about logos as logic. And I think it's important to remember that this model, idea puzzle, covers or tries to cover all types of empirical research. So if it's qualitative, I call that inductive logic, because you are justifying your qualitative research with a recent topic. There is no theory to deduct hypothesis yet. So little theory, and that means it's going to be questions, and questions we answer with qualitative, okay? And qualitative means a small sample of one or few cases, small sample. And if it's quantitative, you can just see it as hypothetic deductive logic. You're going to test hypothesis, and that it means that the topic is mature, maybe some decades old, and that means you have a lot of theory to deduct hypothesis. So it's going to be hypothesis testing, not questions. And with this, we can say it's quantitative. With inferential statistics, you need a large sample. So choose one of the logics and see how the idea puzzle is helping you integrate everything. And this is something also addressing the conclusions of your research, right? You write, therefore, in the conclusions, we answer the question, we test hypotheses. And finally, Aristotle talks about ethos as credibility. And I see a discussion of credibility in the conclusions of your work when you talk about limitations. You have credibility because you are critical about your work. You say, this study has limitations. The only problem I see is that we only talk about empirical limitations. We say, well, we have data, but we could have more data. The sample is small. But the sample is not just data. The literature review is also a sample. You could have more, right? The method is also a sample. You could have more. So in your conclusions, you could talk about limitations as empirical, but also theoretical and methodological. If you do that, I think your limitations discussion in the conclusions will be more interesting. and credible. That's what we want. And finally, I would like to tell you that for philosophers of science, there is still very little reflexivity in research. We still think that it's better to write. Look at the writing style. I'm going to write the study concluded, to be more scientific. The study concluded. It's not true. There is a researcher there. You are there, right? The study, or maybe the researcher, to be more impersonal. The researcher, or maybe we. Very seldom I. So even the writing style shows that we don't talk much about ourselves, right? But the French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, spoke of cultural capital, and here I call it wisdom, to remind you that if you can choose two topics, choose the one you have more education about, more personal experience, and more professional experience. Why? Because I can guarantee that more and more I read senior scholars saying that worse than bias is no first-hand experience of the phenomena you are researching. You see, if you have this experience, first-hand experience of the phenomena, you will be more critical when reading the literature. Okay? Yet we are a bit afraid of being biased. I think you are only biased when your conclusions are the same as your initial assumptions. Okay? Other than that's politics, trying to prove you're right. But other than that, I think it's good to bring a little bit more of yourself to make your research more authentic. And then Pierre Bourdieu talk about social capital, and indeed we talk about networking. But here I want to emphasize the support network that you will need, which is much more than your supervisor, because it will give you access to theory, method, and data, the three sides of the idea puzzle triangle. So don't overestimate your supervisor with 3 million PDFs per year. And this is something you're going to probably write in your acknowledgements, right? So even that affects your writing. And finally, Pierre Bourdieu used to talk about economic capital. So yes, you need funding, and most of all, you need time. Because some fields don't need so much money. But I can tell you that the Council of Graduate Studies in Washington in 2008, 15 years ago, the year we created Idea Puzzle, showed us that only, look at this, only 30% of part-timers complete the PhD in 10 years. Isn't that shocking? In fact, only 50% of full-timers. Well, that shows that you need to think well a research proposal, article, or thesis. You need to think well the risks of your PhD. And you need to focus, right? If 10 years is not enough, even for full-timers, you're just diverging. You're not converging, okay? So I try my best to make a research design inspired by my own PhD in 1 hour. But what I want to show you is that after self-evaluating my decisions here, what Idea Puzzle does is a simple average of your self-evaluation, and it puts all together into a document that you can share in PDF for the Idea Puzzle Prize, or in Word for your supervisors to give you comments. And it puts together your decisions, not much text, as you can see, just my decisions. And some of them are something that it's final, it's green, others are still pending, still open, and others are not yet decided, pending. We don't look at your self-evaluation for the prize. What we look is at the coherence between your answers. So please remember, until the 30th of June this year and every year, we really like very much that you submit your PDF to our Idea Puzzle Prize, okay? So please feel free to make any questions about the model, the theoretical model I presented, the software, the website, or the prize. now in these final minutes, and you can use the chat or turn the mic on to make those questions. Thank you so much. Anyone? If no questions, I thank your presence this morning, and I look forward to your applications for the prize. I will send you by email this presentation, this document, plus the recording of this session, and I will remind you that you have free access to the Idea Puzzle software at ideapuzzle.com with an email ending up.pt or uporto.pt, and that you can apply for the Idea Puzzle prize until the 30th of June. Thank you so much, and all the best to your doctoral project. Thank you.